Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the Voice of Reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. So a lot of events are occurring within the confines of the conflict. We are seeing continued Russian cruise missile strikes, ballistic missile strikes throughout Ukraine. It appears the Russians have increased the frequency of which they are hitting targets throughout Ukraine. Additionally, it also appears the Russians have achieved a military breakthrough in the northern sector of the conflict. Specifically, that is this region here that runs to the east of this major reservoir in the northeastern quadrant of the conflict. And again, this is an area that is north of Sloviansk, just to the north of Lyman and within the vicinity of area near Kupiansk. So what's happened? Well, it appears that we have multiple Russian divisions that have launched a fairly sizable offensive operation against Ukrainian forces. If we look at the time lapse of what has occurred over the last few days, you can clearly see just what has happened here. And this is the breakthrough that the Russians have achieved. The Russians have focused quite a bit of combat power in this area. Specifically, if we go over to the deployment map, and we have a look at what the Russians have in this area, or reportedly have in this area. We have the 144th Motorized Rifle Division, elements of that division. We have the 4th Tank Division, which is part of the 1st Guards Tank Army. And then we also have elements of the 76th Air Assault Division as well, to include independent brigades that are also operating in this area. So essentially you have elements of 3 divisions and reinforced brigades operating in this area. So what are the Russians trying to do? Well, if the Russians achieve a breakthrough in this central section of the reservoir front, and they are able to move and get to the reservoir, the eastern bank of the reservoir, near, how do you say that, Barova. If they're able to do that, and at the same time they're able to launch operations in the north near Kupiansk, and if you look here, you have a terrain feature, you have a river which feeds the reservoirs, but if the Russians are able to knock out this bridge and have any success here in the north, which they are indeed trying to do, they are moving towards Kupiansk, or trying to move towards Kupiansk. If they can sever this area here and prevent the reinforcement of additional Ukrainian forces back and forth along this area, the Ukrainian forces that are trapped near the center section of the reservoir north are going to be in a precarious situation. It means these forces, these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, essentially 6, 7 Ukrainian brigades could indeed be trapped in a pincer movement by Russian forces. Again, you have the Russians trying to move towards the center section here and in the north here. So they would end up trapping these Ukrainian forces in this pincer movement. And in this area, you have a sizable Ukrainian force. You have the 103rd Territorial Defense Brigade, you have the 32nd Mechanized Brigade, the 92nd Mechanized Brigade, the 43rd Mechanized Brigade, 88th Mechanized Brigade, 14th Mechanized Brigade, 27th Rocket Artillery Brigade, and to a lesser effect, these 2 units up here. But again, these units appear to be on the opposite side of this river to the on the western bank of it, acting as a blocking force for any Russian incursions closer to moving on Kharkov. So that's kind of the situation it stands right now. But again, clearly the Russians were able to break through in this area. Again, just kind of looking at what happened over the last few days. In this map, given that it is a Ukrainian supporting map, isn't always giving out the most accurate information in terms of Russian movements and just what the Russians have taken control over. So again, if we look at it and we speed up to kind of where we're at today, a fairly sizable area of this area east of the reservoir has been taken by Russian forces. And we're seeing from video documentation, video evidence, the use of Russian T-90 tanks. We're seeing continued use of Russian Ka-52 attack helicopters in these areas. So the Russians are using some of their best equipment, some of their best units in this operation in the north. Now, as we know, the Ukrainian operation in the south failed. The offensive operation by the Ukrainians to try and move south, sever the land corridor to the Crimea, was unsuccessful. And here in the West, we continue to hear about the U.S. Pentagon, the U.S. Department of Defense saying, well, the Ukrainians still have sizable forces in reserve. Well, what are the Ukrainians going to do with those forces? They're not going to use those remaining 6 to 8 brigades, possibly less, possibly more, in a failed offensive in Zaporizhia. The Ukrainians used some of their best combat units, some of their best combat power in trying to break the Russian lines here in the south. And they couldn't even get to the first line of Russian defensive lines. They were unable to do it. Again, they made these small salients of just a couple kilometers, in some cases hundreds of meters, in this area. So very unsuccessful operation. We think at this point the Ukrainians are probably going to try and hold this area, redirect forces towards Kupiansk in the battle for the reservoir. I think this is going to become the new focused area of this conflict. It's very, very clear that the Russians have very robust, established defensive lines well behind the line of contact. If you look at just how far the Russians have penetrated to where their main defensive line is, again, 23 kilometers. And that's just perfect for some of this long-range Russian artillery, their heavy artillery, the multiple launch rocket systems, their continued use of attack helicopters. Again, these 5 Ukrainian brigades, 5 or 6 Ukrainian brigades in this northern sector that are east of the reservoir are in an incredibly precarious situation. And we could see the possibility of a devastating defeat by the Ukrainians in terms of possibly losing those brigades if the Russians establish a fairly quick, rapid breakthrough and seize control of the main route over the reservoir or destroy it, and while at the same time keying in on areas to the north as well. So if you look at the map here, again, there's essentially 3 crossing points. 1, 2, 3. And you have essentially 6 Ukrainian brigades in this area. Now, if we take a look at a satellite image, this area, again, fairly open fields. Again, the Russians using those attack helicopters, those kamikaze drones. This area is not a good place to be if you are a Ukrainian mechanized unit or tank unit, because the Russians can see you. It gets a little bit different down here in the south again towards Lyman, just to the east and south of Lyman, where it's fairly forested. So a little bit better conditions for defensive operations. We understand the Russians are using mostly Spetsnaz, light infantry, airborne forces, and fighting these infantry battles down in this area. So the main effort for Russian forces, and we talked about this before, we believed that the Russians were building up forces north of Seversk, and we're looking to do something in this area, and it appears that something has started. Again, the Russians have broken through this area here and appear to be squeezing those Ukrainian forces here in this northeastern sector. And again, if we go back over to the deployment map, you can see exactly what we're talking about. So this is the situation that the Ukrainians really don't want to be in, and the Russians again have amassed quite a bit of combat power, multiple division formations in this area to launch this counter operation against Ukrainian forces. So that's kind of where we stand for today. You can hear the talk out of the Pentagon. You can hear the disappointment in terms of what is being talked about in reference to the failed Ukrainian offensive. There was a lot of hope in some of the Western spheres of influence prior to June 4th and going up to June 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th. There was quite a very large segment of the political leadership, of the political elite in the West that firmly believed that the Russian lines were going to collapse, that the Russian forces had very poor morale, and all the Ukrainians had to do was kick in the door, and this whole area south of Zaporizhia would fall apart. That's what they were hoping for. They were hoping to be to place through battlefield success the Russians in a political handicap, meaning, hey, look, we've destroyed your forces in the south, we've severed your land corridor to the Crimea, we've destroyed or are in the process of trying to destroy your ability to move across the Kerch Strait Bridge. Capitulate. Capitulate. And it didn't happen. $70, $80 billion of Western treasure for what? 1,000 meters of territory and the loss of 30 to 35% of the armored vehicles and tanks that were handed over to the Ukrainians. But again, there are individuals in the U.S. military, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, that completely understood that what they were trying to do was not going to work because of Russian air power. No matter how bad they believed Russian morale was, or the disposition of those forces in the south was in terms of capability and quality, at the end of the day, again, you're looking at open fields with a country, meaning Russia, that has a fairly proficient air force, while the adversary, the Ukrainian military, simply doesn't have one. And therein lies the crux of the issue for the Ukrainians. It didn't work. They don't have an air force, so at the end of the day, very, very difficult to achieve battlefield success. And you can clearly see that there are individuals with very little military experience looking at this conflict, talking about this conflict. Obviously, there are content providers here on YouTube that have fled the Ukraine and are talking about this conflict as if they know what's happening on the ground, as if they knew that this Ukrainian offensive was going to be successful. And it wasn't, because they don't know what they're talking about. They are uneducated in the operational art. And this is what has happened. And this is where we stand today. So we will continue to monitor the situation. We appreciate everyone joining us today. I will have the synopsis on my experience at the Parasitic Palace very, very shortly. And I will have that up for everyone to review. Thank you for joining us. More to come very, very soon. And as always, have a good day.